Parents abandon their daughter on an abandoned farm, unaware of who owned the place. When desperate parents leave their young daughter at what they believe is an empty farmhouse, they think they're giving her a chance at survival they can no longer provide. But the land remembers. The house remembers. And the woman who once lived there left something behind that doesn't forget. What begins as an act of abandonment becomes a journey into the heart of what we inherit, what we become, and what waits in the silence between one life ending and another beginning. Stay until the end. This story will change the way you see family forever. If this story moves you, leave a like and subscribe for more narratives that touch the soul. The girl's name was written on a piece of cardboard, tucked into the collar of her coat, like a shipping label on a package no one wanted to claim. 7 letters in trembling black ink, Mary Ann. The coat itself was too large, the sleeves swallowing her small hands, the hem dragging through the frost-hardened dirt as her mother walked her across the gravel driveway. The woman's fingers were wrapped around the child's wrist. Not cruelly, but without tenderness either, the grip of someone performing a necessary amputation. Behind them, the truck's engine ticked and cooled in the pre-dawn darkness, exhaust still lingering in the air like a departing ghost. The father sat inside, face turned away toward the window, watching nothing. Watching everything. Watching the moment his family ended. The farmhouse loomed ahead, a skeletal silhouette against the bruised purple sky. Its windows were dark and hollow, the porch sagging like a mouth pulled down by invisible strings. Paint peeled from the siding in long, curling strips that reminded Mary Ann of skin after a sunburn. The barn beyond had partially collapsed, its roof caved inward as though something had reached down from the sky and pressed a thumb into it. There were no lights, no smoke from the chimney, no signs that anyone had lived here in years. The mother had chosen this place because it looked abandoned but sturdy enough to offer shelter. She had chosen it because it was far from the highway, hidden by overgrown trees and the gentle roll of hills. She had chosen it because she couldn't bear to leave her daughter on the street. And this felt like mercy. What she didn't know was that the land had been owned by a woman named Constance Holloway, who had died here 3 winters ago. What she didn't know was that Constance had been a midwife, a healer, and something older than both, a keeper of thresholds, a woman who understood that every ending holds a beginning and every abandonment is also a return. The house had been Constance's temple. The fields had been her altar. And when she died, alone in the upstairs bedroom with her hands folded across her chest, she had whispered something into the silence. A promise, a preparation, an invitation for whoever came next. The mother knelt down in front of Mary Ann, her face a battlefield of collapsing composure. She tried to smile, but her lips only quivered. She tried to speak, but the words shattered in her throat like glass. So instead, she reached in her pocket and pulled out a small cloth bundle. Inside were 3 things: a photograph of the family when they had been whole, a silver locket that had belonged to Mary Ann's grandmother, and a folded letter the girl was too young to read. The mother pressed these items into her daughter's hands, closed the small fingers around them, and held them there for a long, suffocating moment. Then she stood, turned, and walked back toward the truck without looking back, because looking back would have killed her. Mary Ann watched the taillights disappear down the long dirt road, their red glow shrinking into pinpricks, then nothing. The silence that followed was absolute, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of held breath, the silence of the world waiting to see what she would do. She stood there, small and impossibly alone, her breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The house behind her seemed to shift, just slightly, as though adjusting itself to her presence. The front door, which had been closed, now hung an inch ajar. And from somewhere deep inside, impossibly faint, came the sound of something that might have been wind or might have been a voice calling her name. Mary Ann did not cry. This was not because she was brave, but because the well of tears inside her had been emptied over the past months, drained slowly by her father's drinking, by her mother's increasingly frantic silences, by the way their home had transformed from a place of warmth into a museum of failure. She had learned that crying changed nothing. So instead, she stood in the cold morning light, clutching the cloth bundle to her chest, and made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would walk through that door. Not because she wanted to, not because she understood what waited inside, but because there was nowhere else to go, and the human animal, when cornered, always moves towards shelter, even when shelter wears the face of the unknown. The porch steps creaked under her weight, each board announcing her arrival with a voice of splintering wood and rusted nails. The sound echoed across the empty fields, and for a moment, Marianne imagined she heard it bounce back, not as an echo, but as an answer, a confirmation that something was listening. The front door swung open at her touch, revealing a hallway that stretched back into darkness. Dust floated in the weak morning light that followed her inside, each particle suspended like a tiny world, drifting in slow orbit. The air smelled of old wood, dried herbs, and something underneath, something like copper and earth, like blood mixed with soil. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was the smell of transformation. She stepped inside, and the door closed behind her. Not with a slam, but with a gentle click, the way a door closes when someone pulls it shut from the inside. Marianne spun around, but there was no one there. Only the door, now firmly latched, and beyond its window, the empty driveway stretching out toward a world that had rejected her. She turned back to the hallway. To her left, a staircase climbed into shadow. To her right, an archway opened into what might have once been a living room. Straight ahead, the hallway continued past doorways and deeper into the house's interior. She chose straight ahead because forward was the only direction that made sense when backward had been severed. The hallway opened into a kitchen that time had frozen in mid-breath. A kettle sat on an old cast-iron stove, its surface covered in dust but positioned as though someone had just set it down. A cup rested beside it, still containing the brown residue of tea leaves at its bottom. The table in the center of the room was set for one. A single plate, a single fork and knife, a single chair pushed slightly back as though its occupant had just risen to answer the door. On the plate sat the desiccated remains of what might have been bread, now hard as stone, a meal interrupted and never resumed. Marianne walked to the table and ran her finger along its surface, leaving a trail through the dust. The gesture felt like desecration and archaeology at once. She was disturbing a shrine, but also uncovering evidence of a life. On the wall above the stove hung a calendar, still turned to November 3 years prior. Someone had circled the date, the 14th, in red ink, and beside it had written 2 words in a spidery, elegant hand, "She comes." Marianne stared at those words, feeling something cold move through her stomach. She comes. Who comes? When? The circle around the date was drawn with such care, such certainty, as though the writer had known exactly what would happen, had prepared for it, had welcomed it. Marianne's fingers unconsciously moved to the cloth bundle still pressed against her chest. She untied it slowly, letting the photograph, the locket, and the letter spill onto the dusty table. The photograph showed her family 2 years ago, her father's arm around her mother's shoulders, both of them smiling in a way that now seemed like a lie or a ghost. Marianne, at 6 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, holding a stuffed rabbit. She picked up the locket next, prying it open with her thumbnail. Inside was a tiny photograph, so old it had faded to sepia, a woman with severe eyes and her hair pulled back, wearing clothes from another century. Her grandmother, she assumed, though she had never met the woman. The face in the photograph seemed to watch her with an expression that was neither kind nor cruel, but absolutely certain, as though she had known, even then, how this would all unfold. The letter was addressed in her mother's handwriting, to whoever finds her. Marianne's chest tightened. She couldn't read yet, not well, but she recognized some of the words: sorry, love, no choice. The letter shook in her hands, and she set it down quickly, as though it were burning her. She didn't want to know what it said. Didn't want to hear her mother's justifications transformed into permanence through written words. Instead, she picked up the locket again and slipped a chain over her head, feeling the weight of it settle against her breastbone. The cold metal seemed to pulse there, or perhaps that was just her heartbeat, rapid and insistent, reminding her that despite everything, she was still alive. A sound from upstairs made her freeze, a soft thump, as though something had been knocked over. Then silence. Then another sound, this one more deliberate. Footsteps, slow and measured, moving across the ceiling above her head. Marianne's breath stopped. Someone was in the house, had been in the house the whole time. Her mind raced through possibilities. A squatter, a homeless person, someone dangerous. But the footsteps didn't sound hurried or furtive. They sounded purposeful. They sounded like someone who had been waiting. The steps moved toward the staircase, began descending, each creak of the wood timed like a metronome. Marianne looked around frantically for somewhere to hide, but the kitchen offered nothing. No closets, no spaces large enough for a child. So she did the only thing she could. She stood very still, pressed her back against the wall beside the archway, and tried to make herself invisible through sheer force of will. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs, paused, then continued down the hallway, moving toward the kitchen with that same unhurried certainty. Marianne squeezed her eyes shut, her hands balled into fists, her whole body tensed for violence or horror. The footsteps entered the kitchen, stopped, and then a voice spoke, a woman's voice, aged but strong, textured like old paper but clear as a bell. "You can open your eyes, child. I've been expecting you." Marianne's eyes flew open. Standing in the doorway was a woman who was and was not there. She existed in that strange space between solid and translucent, like a photograph projected onto smoke. She wore a long dress that might have been blue or gray or both, her silver hair braided and coiled at the back of her head. Her face was deeply lined, but her eyes were sharp and bright. The same eyes from the locket, Marianne realized with a jolt. The same expression of absolute certainty. This was Constance Holloway. This was the woman who had died here 3 winters ago. This was a ghost. "You're not real," Marianne whispered, her voice cracking on the words. "I'm as real as you need me to be," Constance replied, moving further into the kitchen with steps that made no sound. "And you, child, need me very much." She gestured toward the table, toward the photograph and locket and letter. "They left you here thinking it was empty. They left you here thinking you'd find shelter or death, and either would ease their guilt. But this land doesn't do empty. This house doesn't do endings. Your mother brought you to the one place in all the world that was prepared for you." Marianne pressed harder against the wall, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. "You're dead. You're not here. Death is just a door, sweet girl. I walked through it, yes, but I left this door open behind me. For you." Constance moved to the table and ran her fingers, or the idea of her fingers, over the photograph. "I was a midwife for 53 years. I brought 312 children into this world. I knew the moment each one took their first breath whether they would be a fighter or a flower, whether they would break the world or heal it. It was my gift and my curse. And in all those years, in all those births, I kept waiting for one particular child. A child who would be abandoned but not destroyed. A child who would be left at my door when I was no longer alive to greet her with hands instead of memory. You, Marianne. I waited for you." The girl's legs began to shake. "Why?" "Because you're a threshold child," Constance said, and her voice carried weight that pressed against Marianne's chest. "Born at the edge of one thing becoming another. Born to parents who couldn't keep you and couldn't let you go, who loved you and failed you in the same breath. Born at the ending of their world and the beginning of yours." The calendar on that wall, November 14th, 3 years ago, that was the day I died. But it was also the day I finished preparing this place for you. I circled it because I knew, the way I always knew. Marianne's mind spun, trying to find purchase in the impossible. "I don't understand." "You will," Constance said, and she smiled, not warmly, but with a kind of fierce satisfaction. "This house is a teaching. These fields are a lesson. And I am the first voice in a chorus that will show you what you're meant to become. Your parents abandoned you, yes, but they abandoned you here. And here, child, Abandonment is the first step of transformation. The ghost moved toward the hallway, then paused and looked back. Come, there's much to show you before the sun sets. And once night falls, the real work begins. Mary Ann followed because terror and curiosity are siblings, born from the same mother, and both compelled her forward with equal force. Constance moved through the house like water flowing downhill, inevitable, unhurried, guided by laws deeper than choice. She led Mary Ann through rooms that seemed to expand and contract in the corner of the girl's vision, spaces that felt larger on the inside than the exterior walls should allow. They passed a sitting room where embroidered cushions sat perfectly arranged on a sofa, each one depicting a different phase of the moon. They passed a study where books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their spines labeled with titles and languages Mary Ann didn't recognize. Some looked like Latin, others like symbols rather than letters, pictograms of transformation and death and rebirth. This was my library, Constance said, pausing at the doorway. Every healer needs a library. Every midwife needs to understand that birth is violent and sacred at once, that bringing something new into the world means something old must tear itself apart to make room. These books taught me that. They'll teach you, too, when you're ready. I can't read most of them, Marian said, her voice small. Not yet, but you'll learn. Time moves differently here, child. What takes years in the world beyond these walls can happen in seasons here. What takes a lifetime can happen in a single winter. You'll grow faster than you should. You'll learn things children shouldn't know. But you'll also become something children rarely are: necessary. They climbed the stairs, each step groaning under Marianne's weight, while making no sound beneath Constance's translucent form. The second floor hallway stretched longer than it should have, lined with doors on both sides, each one closed except for the last. That door stood open, revealing a bedroom bathed in pale afternoon light. The room was simple: a bed with a patchwork quilt, a dresser with a copper mirror, a window overlooking the field beyond. On the bed lay a collection of clothes, all size for a child, all clean and carefully folded. Beside them sat a pair of small boots, worn but sturdy. "I prepared these for you," Constance said. "I knew you'd arrive in whatever rags your parents could spare. I knew you'd need warmth, need protection. The clothes were mine when I was your age. I kept them all these years, preserved them, waiting. They'll fit you perfectly. They always fit the child they're meant for." Marianne walked slowly into the room, her fingers reaching out to touch the fabric of a wool dress, dark green with small wooden buttons. It was softer than anything she'd worn in months, softer than anything her parents had been able to afford as their lives crumbled. She picked it up, held it against herself, and saw in the copper mirror that it would indeed fit perfectly, as though it had been sewn to her measurements by someone who knew her body better than she knew it herself. "Get changed," Constance said. "Then we'll walk the land. You need to understand what you've inherited." "I haven't inherited anything," Marianne said, the words sharp with the defensive edge of a child who understands too much. "This isn't mine. I'm just hiding here until someone finds me or I die." Constance's expression shifted, not to anger, but to a kind of fierce intensity that made the air in the room feel heavier. "Listen to me, child, and listen well. You think abandonment is the end of the story. You think being left behind means you are nothing. But I tell you this: every prophet was abandoned. Every leader was cast out. Every healer learned their gift in the wilderness of rejection. Your parents brought you to the threshold because they had no other choice, but the threshold doesn't care about their intentions. It only cares about who walks through. And you walk through. You're here. And here, you are everything." The words hit Marianne like stones, each one finding a soft place inside her and lodging there. She wanted to reject them, to insist that she was just a discarded child in an abandoned house, speaking to a hallucination born from trauma and cold. But something deeper, something that lived below thought, in the place where instinct and truth wrestled, whispered that Constance was right, that she had been brought here for a reason that transcended her parents' desperation, that the universe or God or whatever moved beneath the skin of reality had placed her exactly where she needed to be. She changed into the green dress, the fabric settling against her skin like a second heartbeat. The boots fit perfectly, their leather molding to her feet as though they remembered her shape from another life. When she looked at herself in the copper mirror, she barely recognized the reflection. No longer a discarded thing, but something beginning to take form, like a sculpture emerging from stone. Constance stood behind her in the mirror, visible in that old glass in ways she wasn't visible in the room itself, her form more solid, more present. "Better," the ghost said. "Now you look like what you're meant to be. Now we can begin." They descended the stairs and walked out the back door into the fields beyond. The land stretched out in gentle rolls and valleys, covered now in the brown remains of last season's crops. Corn stalks broken and bent, their husks rattling in the cold wind. At the far edge of the property stood a line of trees, their bare branches reaching up like black veins against the gray sky. Between the house and the trees, scattered at irregular intervals, were stones, large, flat stones set into the earth, each one carved with symbols that looked like letters but weren't quite letters, more like the idea of language before language had fully formed. "These are markers," Constance explained as they walked among them. "Each one represents a woman who came before me. Women who lived on this land and learned its secrets. Women who understood that healing and death are two sides of the same hand, that birth and ending are the same moment viewed from different angles. There are 17 markers here. I am the 17th. You, Marianne, will be the 18th. But not yet. First, you must learn. Learn what? How to listen to what the land is teaching. How to read the language of seasons and silence. How to understand that everything abandoned becomes sacred, because abandonment strips away all the false protections we build around ourselves and leaves only the essential core. Look at these fields. They look dead, don't they? Brown and broken and finished. But underneath, in the soil, seeds are sleeping. Roots are spreading. The whole field is preparing for spring, for the moment when death cracks open and life comes pouring through. That's what you are, child. A seed in winter. Sleeping, but preparing. Dead to the world above, but ferociously alive underneath. They walked to the edge of the tree line, where a small structure stood. A shed or workshop, its walls made of rough-hewn wood, its roof covered in moss. Constance pushed open the door, and inside was a space that smelled of dried plants and earth and something medicinal, something that made Marianne's sinuses clear and her mind sharpen. Bundles of herbs hung from the ceiling, lavender and sage and others she couldn't name. Shelves lined the walls, holding jars filled with dried flowers, roots, seeds, powders in every color from white to deepest black. In the center of the room stood a wooden table, its surface stained and scarred from years of work, and on that table lay a book bound in leather so old it looked like skin. "This was my workshop," Constance said, "where I made the remedies I used for birthing. Teas to ease pain, salves to prevent infection, tinctures to stop bleeding or start contractions when a baby was overdue. But it was also more than that. It was where I worked with the deeper medicines, the ones that don't just heal the body, but transform the soul. The ones that require sacrifice and precision and absolute understanding that you are working with forces that can kill as easily as cure." Marianne stepped closer to the table, her eyes drawn to the book. Its cover bore no title, only a symbol pressed into the leather. A circle containing a triangle containing another circle, with lines radiating out from the center like a compass rose or a star. She reached out to touch it, but Constance's voice stopped her. "Not yet. That book contains 300 years of knowledge, passed from woman to woman, each one adding her discoveries to what came before. It contains the formula for every medicine I ever made, every lesson I ever learned, every secret the land ever whispered to me. But also contains warnings, recipes that must never be used carelessly, truths that can shatter an unprepared mind. You'll read it when you're ready, when you've survived your first winter here and proven that you can bear what this place requires." "What does it require?" Marianne asked, her voice barely a whisper. Constance turned to face her fully, and in the dim light of the workshop, her translucent form seemed to solidify, to become almost flesh again. It requires that you become the keeper of thresholds, that you learn to stand between life and death, between ending and beginning, and guide others through. That you never forget what abandonment feels like, so that when others come to you abandoned, and they will come, child, they always come, you can receive them not with pity, but with recognition, with the knowledge that abandonment is not the end of their story, but the violent, necessary beginning of their transformation. The ghost moved closer until she and Marianne stood face to face, until the child could see every line in that ancient face, every story written into the landscape of her skin. Your parents left you here because they were drowning and couldn't hold on to you anymore. They thought they were condemning you to death or chance. But I tell you this, they left you at the one door in all the world that was waiting to open. They left you in the care of the land itself. And the land is a better mother than most flesh and blood women will ever be. It will teach you through seasons. It will speak to you through storms and silence. And when you have learned its language, when you have become fluent in the grammar transformation, you will understand that you were never abandoned at all. You were delivered. The first winter nearly killed her, not from cold or hunger, for the house provided both warmth and food in ways that defied logic. The pantry, which should have been empty, contained jars of preserved vegetables, dried meat, flour and sugar and salt in quantities that never seemed to diminish no matter how much Marianne consumed. The firewood stacked beside the stove replenished itself overnight, the pile always exactly the same height each morning. These impossibilities frightened her at first, but fear gives way to acceptance when survival depends on it. And Marianne learned to stop questioning the house's provisions and simply receive them with the gratitude of the desperate. No, the winter tried to kill her through silence, through the crushing weight of absolute solitude. Constance appeared less frequently as the cold deepened, her form growing fainter, her visits shorter. "I'm tied to the warm months," she explained during one of her brief materializations. "My energy comes from the living earth. And in winter, the earth sleeps so deeply that even the dead struggle to wake. You'll have to learn to be alone, child, to sit with yourself in the silence until you understand that you are not empty. You are full, full of all the things you've been too busy to notice when the world was shouting at you." But Marianne was 8 years old, and 8-year-olds are not built for solitude the way monks and mystics are. She talked to herself constantly, her voice filling the empty rooms with questions and observations and songs she half remembered from before. She named the mice that lived in the walls. There was Frederick, who came out at dusk, and Margaret, who was braver and appeared during the day. She had conversations with them, imagining their responses, creating whole personalities and histories for these small creatures who shared her exile. She drew pictures on the dust-coated windows, using her finger to sketch faces and houses and families, then wiped them away and drew them again, the same scenes repeating like a ritual or a prayer. On the longest night of winter, when darkness came at 4 in the afternoon and didn't lift until past 8 the next morning, Marianne woke from a nightmare to find herself absolutely alone in a way she had never experienced before. The house was cold despite the fire. The darkness outside the windows was so complete it looked solid, like she was entombed in stone. And the silence was so heavy it pressed against her eardrums until they ached, until she wanted to scream just to shatter it. She sat up in the bed, her breath coming fast and shallow, panic rising in her chest like floodwater. She was going to die here, alone, forgotten. She would become a small skeleton in a too large dress, found years from now by whoever finally bought this property, a mystery that no one would bother to solve. The panic crescendoed until she couldn't breathe, until her vision started to gray at the edges, until she was certain her heart would simply stop from the sheer terror of her isolation. And then, in that moment of absolute crisis, something shifted. The panic didn't disappear. It broke like a wave hitting a cliff, and in the spray and foam of its breaking, Marianne felt something underneath. A presence. Not Constance, not anything she could name, but a kind of attention, as though the house itself, or the land, or something even larger, had turned its awareness toward her and was waiting to see what she would do. She stopped fighting the panic and instead let herself fall into it. Let herself feel the full weight of her abandonment, her loneliness, her terror. And as she fell, she discovered that there was a bottom, that the abyss she feared was actually finite, actually survivable. She hit that bottom hard, and it hurt, but didn't kill her. She lay there in the darkness of her own fear, her own grief, and found that she could breathe even there, could think even there, could begin to climb back up even there. When morning finally came, gray and cold, and somehow more beautiful than any sunrise she'd ever seen, Marianne understood something that would shape the rest of her life. That the only way through fear is directly into it. That the only way to survive abandonment is to stop fighting it and instead learn what it has to teach. She rose from the bed feeling different, not happy, not healed, but fundamentally changed. She had died in the night, in a sense. The child who believed her parents were coming back, who believed someone would rescue her, who believed the world owed her protection. That child was gone. In her place was someone harder, sharper, more essential. Someone who could survive. As winter slowly released its grip and early spring began to show itself in small signs, a green shoot pushing through the frozen ground, a bird returning to sing from a bare branch, Constance's visits became more frequent again. She found Marianne in the workshop one morning, the leather-bound book open on the table, the girl's finger tracing the symbols on its pages even though she couldn't yet read the words. "You opened it," Constance said, surprise in her voice. "I needed to," Marianne replied, not looking up. "I needed to see what came next. Well, I'm supposed to learn." "And what did you find?" Marianne turned to a page near the beginning, where someone had drawn a diagram in faded ink. A woman's body in profile, pregnant, the baby positioned inside her with lines indicating its position, its possibilities. "I found this," she said, "and I understood something. Birth is violent because transformation is violent. The baby has to break through. The mother has to tear open. Nothing new enters the world gently. It all comes through blood and screaming and the complete destruction of what came before." Constance moved closer, her form more solid now, fed by the returning spring. "Yes, and I'm being born," Marianne said, her voice steady and clear. "This whole winter, you leaving me alone, the silence, the fear, it was labor. The old me was too comfortable, too protected, too soft. That version couldn't survive what's coming. So she had to die, had to be broken down and remade into something harder, something sharp enough to cut through whatever tries to stop me. You weren't abandoning me when you stopped visiting. You were letting me be born." The ghost's face transformed, not into a smile exactly, but into an expression of fierce recognition. The look a teacher gives when a student finally grasps the lesson that cannot be taught, only discovered. "You're ready," she said. "Sooner than I expected, but yes, you're ready. Come, there's something I need to show you while the spring is still new and the boundary between worlds is thin." They walked together out to the fields, where the first green shoots of new growth were pushing through the soil, tentative and brave, defying the frost that still threatened each night. Constance led Marianne to the center of the field, where a stone larger than the others sat half buried in the earth. This one bore no symbol, no name. It was blank, waiting. "This is yours," Constance said. "When your time comes, and it will come, decade from now if you're lucky, sooner if you're not, you'll be buried here beside the 17 who came before you. Your name will be carved into this stone. And another woman will stand here, looking at it, preparing to become the 19th. The land remembers everyone who serves it, everyone who learns its lessons and teaches them forward. You'll never be forgotten, Marianne. Not here, not by those who matter." Marianne knelt beside the stone, pressed her palms against its rough surface. It was cold from the earth, but underneath that cold, she could feel something else, a warmth, a pulse, as though the stone itself were alive, were waiting for her with the patience of geology. She understood then that this was her inheritance, not money or property in the legal sense, but something infinitely more valuable, a lineage, a purpose. a place in a story that stretched back centuries and would continue long after she was gone. "Who will teach me?" she asked, looking up at Constance. "You said you're weaker in winter, that you can't be here all the time. How will I learn everything I need to know?" "The book will teach you," Constance replied, "and the land will teach you, and the people who come here, and they will come, drawn by need they don't understand, guided by forces they don't believe in. They will teach you by letting you practice on them what you've learned. You'll make mistakes. You'll fail sometimes. You'll watch people die that you try to save. But each failure will sharpen your knowledge, will show you what you missed, what you need to study more deeply. And slowly, over seasons and years, you'll become what I was, what all the women buried in these fields were. A threshold keeper, a guide for those passing through the violent spaces between one life and the next." "I'm only 8, Marianne whispered. "You're only 8 on the outside," Constance said. "Inside, you're already ancient. You became ancient the moment your mother let go of your hand. You became ancient the moment you walked through that door alone. Age isn't about years, child. It's about what you've survived. And you've survived what most people don't face until death comes for them." The years that followed moved like a river, sometimes swift and turbulent, sometimes slow and deep, but always flowing in one direction, toward the person Marianne was meant to become. She devoured the leather-bound book, teaching herself to read through its pages, using the illustrations to understand the words, cross-referencing the recipes against the jars in the workshop until she could identify every herb by sight and smell and the texture of its leaves between her fingers. She learned which plants stopped bleeding and which ones started it, which ones brought sleep and which ones brought visions, which ones could ease a difficult birth and which ones could end a pregnancy before it took hold. Dangerous knowledge, but necessary knowledge, the kind that couldn't be unlearned once acquired. She also learned that the house existed slightly outside normal time. Seasons passed, yes, but they passed at a pace that didn't quite match the world beyond the property line. A winter that should have been 3 months stretched to 4 or 5, giving her extra time to study, to practice, to prepare. A summer compressed itself into weeks of intense growth and heat, as though the land was accelerating its lessons, cramming knowledge into her like a student before an exam. She aged, but slowly, her body taking years to change in ways that should have taken months. By the time she looked 12, she had been at the farmhouse for 7 years. By the time she looked 16, another decade had passed. Time was teaching her its own lesson, that clocks and calendars were human inventions, that the real measure of time was transformation, and transformation followed its own schedule. On a morning in what might have been her 10th year or her 20th, she had stopped counting, stopped caring. Marianne was working in the workshop, grinding dried nettle into powder for a tea that eased inflammation, when she heard a sound she hadn't heard since the day she arrived, a car engine. She froze, the mortar and pestle forgotten in her hands, her whole body tensed like an animal sensing a predator. A car meant people. People meant the world beyond the property. The world beyond meant questions she couldn't answer, authorities who would take her away, institutions that would try to fix her or save her or study her like a specimen. She moved quickly to the window and peered out through the dusty glass. An old truck, rust-colored and battered, was making its way up the long driveway, moving slowly as though the driver was uncertain this was the right place. It stopped in front of the house, and a woman climbed out. She was young, maybe 20, with dark circles under her eyes and the kind of thin exhaustion that comes from months of not sleeping, not eating properly, not finding any peace. She carried a bundle in her arms, a bundle that moved, that made small sounds. A baby. Marianne's heart began to pound, but not with fear, with recognition. This was it. This was what Constance had prepared her for. Someone abandoned, someone broken, someone standing at a threshold and looking for a guide to help them cross over. She set down the mortar and pestle, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked out of the workshop toward the house. By the time she reached the front porch, the young woman had climbed the steps and was standing at the door, her hand raised to knock, her whole body trembling. "Please," the woman said, her voice cracking. "Please, I know this place is supposed to be empty, but I saw smoke from the chimney, and I don't know where else to go. My baby is sick. Fever. Won't eat. I took her to the hospital, but they said I needed insurance, needed money, needed papers I don't have, and Her voice broke completely, and tears spilled down her face. Please, I'll do anything. I'll pay you somehow. Just please help her. Marianne looked at the baby, a girl, maybe 6 months old, her small face flushed with fever, her breathing rapid and shallow. Pneumonia? Probably, or bronchitis. Something bacterial that needed antibiotics in the normal world, but in this place, in this house, there were other remedies. Older remedies. She thought of the book, of the recipe for fever reduction and lung clearing, of the careful measurements required, of the risk inherent in treating a child so young. She thought of all the warnings Constance had given her. You'll make mistakes. You'll fail sometimes. You'll watch people die that you try to save. But she also thought of the 17 stones in the field, of the women who had stood exactly where she was standing, faced with exactly this choice, to turn away and preserve their safety, or to step forward and risk everything to serve the purpose they'd been made for. She thought of her own mother, letting go of her hand in this very spot, abandoning her to chance or fate or whatever forces moved beneath the visible world. And she understood, with absolute clarity, that this woman was not just bringing a sick baby. She was bringing Marianne's entire life into focus, giving her the first chance to become what she'd spent years preparing to be. Come inside, Marianne said, stepping back to open the door wider. I can help her, but you have to trust me, and you have to do exactly what I say. Can you do that? The woman nodded desperately, clutching her baby tighter. Yes, anything. Then follow me. Marianne led her through the house to the kitchen, cleared the table with a sweep of her arm, and gestured for the woman to lay the baby down. The child looked worse in the bright light from the window, her breathing more labored, her fever radiating heat that Marianne could feel from foot away. She pressed her fingers gently against the baby's chest, feeling the rattle inside, the congestion that was drowning her from within. It was bad, maybe too bad, but maybe, just maybe, catchable. She ran back to the workshop, her mind racing through the recipe, the measurements, the timing. She grabbed jars from the shelf, mullein for the lungs, yarrow for the fever, elderberry for the immune system, a tiny amount of lobelia to open the airways, but not too much or it would suppress breathing further. She mixed them in precise ratios, ground them together, added them to boiling water to make a tea strong enough to be medicinal, but not so strong it would poison. She let it steep for exactly 7 minutes, counting each second, then strained it and poured it into a small bottle. Back in the kitchen, she found the woman pacing, holding her baby, whispering prayers or promises or apologies, maybe all three at once. Marianne touched her arm gently. I need you to give her this. 1 small spoonful every hour for the rest of today and tonight. By morning, the fever should break. The breathing should ease. But you have to stay here. You can't leave until she's recovered. If you try to take her out into the cold now, she'll get worse. She could die. The woman's eyes filled with fresh tears. I don't have anywhere to go anyway, she whispered. I've been living in my truck for 3 weeks. I have $40 left and no job and no family. And she broke down completely, her whole body shaking with sobs that she'd been holding back for what looked like months. Marianne took the baby gently from her arms, cradling the hot, small weight, and administered the first spoonful of medicine. The child grimaced at the taste, but swallowed, then settled against Marianne's shoulder with a small sigh. You can stay here, Marianne said quietly. There's a room upstairs. Clean sheets. You can rest. I'll watch her tonight. I'll make sure she's okay. Why are you helping me? The woman asked, wiping her face with shaking hands. You don't know me. I could be anyone. Marianne looked at her, really looked at her, and saw herself 10 years ago, standing in this same kitchen, abandoned and terrified and certain she would die alone. She saw the 17 women buried in the field, each of whom had stood at this same threshold and chosen to cross over, to transform abandonment into purpose, isolation into service. She saw Constance, translucent and watching from the corner of the room, nodding with approval that warmed Marianne more than any fire. "I'm helping you," Marianne said, "because someone helped me when I needed it most. Because this house doesn't let people die who can be saved. Because you found your way here, which means you were meant to. And because I know what it feels like to be abandoned, and I swore I would never let anyone else feel that way if I had the power to stop it." The baby recovered over 3 days, her fever breaking in the pre-dawn hours of the second night, her breathing clearing by the afternoon of the third day. The woman, her name was Sarah, cried when Marianne placed the healthy, babbling child back in her arms. Not tears of relief, though there was relief in them. These were different tears, deeper tears. The tears of someone who has been drowning and suddenly felt hands grip them and pull them to the surface. The tears of someone who thought they were unseen by the universe and suddenly discovered they were being held. "I don't understand," Sarah said, rocking her daughter gently. "The hospital turned me away. The shelter said they were full. Everyone I asked for help said no, said they couldn't, said they had rules or policies or reasons. But you didn't even hesitate. You're just a—" She stopped, looking at Marianne with confusion. "How old are you?" "Old enough," Marianne said. And it was true, even if the truth was complicated. Age doesn't matter when you have knowledge. When you have purpose. Who taught you? Where did you learn all this? The medicine, the herbs, all of it. Marianne glanced toward the corner where Constance stood, more visible now than she had been in months, her form solid enough that Marianne could see the texture of her dress, the individual strands of her braided hair. The ghost smiled, and in that smile was permission, was blessing, was the passing of something intangible but absolutely real from one generation to the next. "I was taught by a woman who died before I met her," Marianne said slowly. "By a house that refused to let me die. By land that insisted I learn its lessons. And by my own abandonment, which turned out to be the most important teacher of all. I was brought here the same way you were, desperate, broken, left behind by everyone I thought would protect me. And I discovered that being left behind isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a different story. A harder story, yes, but also a truer one." Sarah stared at her, trying to process this information, to fit it into some framework that made sense. "You were abandoned here? As a child? When I was 8 years old. My parents drove me here and left me on the porch. They thought the place was empty. They thought they were condemning me to death, or maybe saving me from a slower death with them. I'll never know which, and it doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that I survived, that I learned, that I became something I never would have become if they had kept me, if they had protected me, if they had raised me the normal way. That's," Sarah struggled for words, "that's horrible. That's child abuse. That's the truth of my life," Marianne said, her voice firm but not angry. "And I can hate them for it, or I can understand that sometimes people are so broken themselves that they can't hold on to what they love. My mother was broken. My father was broken. They broke me by leaving me. But the breaking was necessary, like a bone that heals stronger at the fracture point, like a seed that has to crack open before it can grow. I'm not grateful for what they did, but I'm also not destroyed by it. I took what they meant as an ending and transformed it into a beginning." Sarah looked down at her baby, then back at Marianne. "Is that what you're doing for me? Transforming my ending into a beginning?" "No," Marianne said gently. "That's what you're doing for yourself. I'm just providing the medicine and the shelter. The transformation? That's your work. You have to decide who you become after this. Whether you let this moment of crisis define you as a victim, or whether you use it as the fire that forges you into something stronger, something capable of surviving whatever comes next." They sat in silence for a long moment, the baby dozing between them, the house settling around them with small creaks and whispers. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice barely audible. "Can I stay? Not forever, but longer? I don't have anywhere to go. And I feel like maybe I'm supposed to be here. Like maybe I found this place for a reason beyond just my baby being sick." Marianne felt something crystallize inside her chest, felt a weight she hadn't known she was carrying suddenly lift. This was it. This was the moment Constance had prepared her for, the moment all the years of study and solitude had been building toward. Sarah wasn't just a person in need. She was the first of many who would come, drawn by forces they couldn't name, to this place that existed slightly outside the normal flow of the world. She was the first person Marianne would teach, the first threshold she would guide someone across, the first seed she would plant that would grow into something beyond herself. "You can stay," Marianne said, "but if you stay, I'll teach you what I know. The herbs, the medicines, the way to listen to what bodies are saying beneath what mouths speak. It's hard work. It requires patience and precision and a willingness to accept that sometimes you'll do everything right and people will still die, will still suffer, will still leave. Can you accept that?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different tears, not grief or relief, but something that looked like hope mixed with determination. "I can learn. I want to learn. Teach me." And so the house that had received one abandoned girl grew to hold two women bound by purpose and need and the understanding that abandonment, when survived, becomes the foundation of an unshakable strength. Sarah stayed. She learned. She watched Marianne treat the people who began to arrive with increasing frequency. Pregnant women who had been turned away by hospitals, sick children whose parents had no insurance, elderly people who had been told they were too expensive to treat. Word spread in the way word always spreads among the desperate. Through whispers, through rumors, through the underground network of people who fall through society's cracks and learn to catch each other. The house provided for them all. The pantry remained full. The rooms upstairs expanded to accommodate whoever needed shelter. And Marianne, who had once been a child shivering on a porch and clothes too thin for the cold, became the keeper of thresholds she had been prepared to be. Constance appeared less often as the years passed. Her work complete, her energy required elsewhere. But sometimes, on quiet mornings when the mist hung low over the fields, Marianne would see her standing among the 17 stones, watching, approving, resting in the knowledge that the chain of women remained unbroken, that the land still had a keeper, that abandonment still transformed into purpose in the house she had prepared. 20 years after Sarah arrived, Marianne stood in the field at dawn, watching a young woman, Sarah's daughter, the baby she had saved, now grown and trained and ready, walk toward the 18th stone, the stone that bore Marianne's name, carved deep and filled with copper that caught the rising sun and blazed like fire. Marianne was older now, her hair shot through with silver, her hands marked with the scars of healing work, burns from salves, cuts from harvested plants, the permanent stains of medicines that had saved hundreds of lives over 2 decades. "I'm ready," Sarah's daughter said, standing beside her. "I've learned everything you can teach me. I know the recipes. I know the rhythms. I know how to listen." "No one is ever fully ready," Marianne replied, but she smiled as she said it. "Readiness is a myth. There's only willingness. The willingness to stand at the threshold when someone arrives broken and bleeding and say, 'I see you. You're not alone. Let me help guide you through. Are you willing?' 'I am.' Then the house is yours. And mine, still for as long as I remain. We'll share it the way Constance and I shared it, the way all the women have shared it, teaching and learning at once, because the work is never finished, the lessons are never complete. Each person who comes teaches us something new about suffering, about healing, about the infinite ways humans can break and the infinite ways they can be made whole again. They walked back toward the house together, and Marianne thought about her parents, who she had not seen or heard from since the morning they left her here. She wondered sometimes if they were alive, if they ever thought about her, if they carried guilt like stones in their pockets. But mostly, she didn't think about them at all. Not with anger, not with forgiveness, but with a kind of neutral acceptance. They had done what they could do, which was not enough, and in the gap between what she needed and what they could provide, she had found her purpose. That gap, that abandonment, that breaking, it had been the making of her. She entered the house, and it wrapped around her the way it always had, the way it wrapped around everyone who needed it, like a mother, like a teacher, like a threshold that swung both ways, allowing exit and entrance, ending and beginning, death and birth to exist in the same space, the same moment. Sarah was in the kitchen making tea, her movements efficient and practiced, her presence so integrated into the house now that Marianne couldn't imagine it without her. Others were scattered throughout the rooms. A woman recovering from a difficult birth upstairs, an elderly man in the sitting room taking medicine for his heart, a teenager in the workshop learning to grind herbs under Sarah's daughter's careful instruction. This was the family she had built, not from blood, but from shared purpose and mutual rescue. Everyone here had been abandoned by someone or something, by parents, by partners, by systems, by their own bodies. Everyone here had arrived broken and been given the tools and time to heal. Not all of them stayed. Most didn't. They recovered and returned to their lives, carrying with them the memory of the house, the knowledge that such places existed, the understanding that abandonment doesn't have to be fatal, that ending can be transformed into beginning by those who have learned the necessary alchemy. Marianne poured herself tea and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the fields where new growth was pushing through the soil, corn and wheat and vegetables she didn't remember planting, but that appeared nonetheless, the land's gift to those who served it. She thought about the leather-bound book upstairs, now heavy with her own additions, her own recipes, her own hard-won knowledge that would pass to Sarah's daughter and then to whoever came after that. The chain continuing forward into a future she would never see but had helped create. She thought about the calendar on the wall, still turned to November 3 years before her arrival, to Constance's circle date and those two prophetic words, she comes. She had come, and by coming, by surviving, by transforming abandonment into purpose and isolation into service, she had become the bridge between one woman's ending and another's beginning. She was the threshold now, the door that swung both ways, the hand extended in the darkness to those who were falling. And when her time came, when she joined the 17 women in the field and became the 18th stone for another woman to stand beside and learn from, she would rest knowing she had done what was required of her. She had taken what her parents meant as destruction and made it into creation. She had turned being left behind into the foundation of a legacy. The sun rose higher, burning away the morning mist, and in its light, the house stood solid and eternal and utterly itself. Neither beautiful nor ugly, neither welcoming nor forbidding, but simply present, simply available, simply waiting for the next person who would need it, who would find it, who would walk through its door and discover that the ending they feared was actually, impossibly, miraculously, the beginning they had been searching for all along. And in that moment, in that knowing, Marianne understood the deepest truth her life had taught her, that we are all abandoned in one way or another, all left on doorsteps, all cast out from gardens, all exiled from the safe kingdoms of our childhoods. But some of us, those who survive the abandonment without letting it poison us, who transform the rejection into fuel rather than using it as excuse, some of us become the doorkeepers for those who come after. We become the light in the window, the smoke from the chimney, the evidence that someone survived and is still here, still working, still willing to extend a hand to the next person who arrives desperate and afraid and certain they're about to die alone. We are the threshold, and the threshold never closes. It only waits, patient as stone, strong as the earth itself, for the next soul who needs to cross from ending into beginning, from death into the fierce, terrible, beautiful violence of being born.